The snow fell harder than Catherine Brennan had ever seen it fall, and she knew with absolute certainty that Jonathan was not coming back for her. She stood outside the weathered boarding house in Cherry Creek, Colorado territory, clutching her threadbare coat tighter against the biting wind that swept down from the mountains. It was December of 1878, and the winter had arrived early and merciless. Her fingers were already numb despite the thin gloves she wore, and her breath came out in white puffs that disappeared into the swirling snow. The boarding house keeper, Mrs. Henderson, had made it clear that morning that Catherine's room would no longer be available come nightfall unless she could produce the $2 she owed for the week. Jonathan had promised to return with the money 3 days ago. He had kissed her forehead, told her he loved her, and ridden out toward Denver with assurances that his brother would loan them enough to get through the winter. She was 20 years old and had believed every word. Now, as darkness crept across the mountains and the temperature dropped further, Catherine understood the truth. Jonathan had left her here deliberately. Perhaps he had never intended to return. Perhaps his sweet words and tender kisses had all been carefully constructed lies designed to keep her compliant until he could slip away without confrontation. She had given up everything to follow him west from St. Louis 6 months ago. Her family had disowned her, her father shouting that she was throwing her life away on a no-account gambler. She had insisted Jonathan was different, that he loved her truly, that they would build a life together in the wild territories where opportunity waited around every corner. The wind picked up and Catherine turned back toward the boarding house door. Mrs. Henderson stood in the window, arms crossed, her expression hard. She shook her head slowly, decisively. The message was clear. No money meant no shelter. Catherine felt tears sting her eyes but refused to let them fall. Crying would accomplish nothing. She needed to think, to plan, to survive. She had 30 cents in her pocket, hardly enough for a meal, let alone lodging. The town was small, consisting of little more than a main street with a general store, 2 saloons, a livery stable, a blacksmith, and the boarding house. There were perhaps 200 souls living in Cherry Creek and the surrounding ranches, most of them men who had come seeking gold or land or escape from lives back east. Single women were rare, and those without protection were rarer still. Catherine walked down the wooden sidewalk, her boots crunching on the snow that had already accumulated several inches deep. The windows of the Silver Dollar Saloon glowed warm with lamplight, and she could hear piano music and rough laughter from within. She knew what happened to women who walked into such establishments alone and desperate. She kept walking. The general store was closing, the proprietor pulling down the shade on the front door just as she approached. She tapped on the glass, and he looked up, saw her, and shook his head. "No charity in this town," his expression said. Everyone had to earn their keep or move along. She wandered past the livery stable where several horses stamped and snorted in their stalls, their warm breath creating clouds of steam in the cold air. A large gray gelding watched her with dark, intelligent eyes as she paused. She had always loved horses. Her grandfather had kept a small farm outside St. Louis, and she had spent her childhood summers there, learning to ride and care for the animals. That felt like a lifetime ago now. "You looking for work or looking to steal?" Catherine spun around to find a tall man standing in the stable doorway. He wore a heavy canvas coat, dusted with snow, dark trousers, and worn boots. His hat was pulled low, shadowing his face, but she could see the sharp line of his jaw and the direct way he looked at her. "Neither, sir," she said, willing her voice not to shake. "I was just admiring the horse, in the middle of a snowstorm." He stepped closer, and she could see his face more clearly now. He was perhaps 25, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and eyes that might have been blue or gray in the fading light. His expression was not unkind, but it was wary. Most folks with good sense are inside by a fire right now. Most folks have somewhere to be inside, Catherine said before she could stop herself. The man studied her for a long moment. You are the woman staying at Henderson's place. I have seen you around town. I was staying there, Catherine corrected. Mrs. Henderson has made it clear my time there is finished. Your husband leave you. The directness of the question should have offended her, but Catherine was too cold and too desperate to waste energy on propriety. The man I traveled here with left me. We were not married. She expected judgment, disgust, or worse. Instead, the man nodded slowly. I see. Do you have family you can wire for help? No. The word came out flat and final, another long pause. The snow continued to fall, and Catherine realized she was shivering almost uncontrollably now. The man noticed too. My name is Daniel Connor, he said. I work for the Triple Bar Ranch about 5 miles north of here. We have been in town getting supplies before the storm gets worse. I cannot leave you out here to freeze. I am not asking for charity, Catherine said, though even as the words left her mouth, she knew how foolish they sounded. She had nothing. She was asking for charity whether she admitted it or not. Good, because I am not offering it, Daniel said. Mrs. Parker, the rancher's wife, needs help with the household. Her daughter just got married and moved to her husband's place up in Wyoming. Mrs. Parker has been complaining for weeks about needing someone who can cook and clean and help with the basics. The work is hard and the pay is modest, but it includes room and board. If you are willing to work, I can take you out there tonight. Catherine stared at him. It seemed too convenient, too perfectly timed. Her experience with Jonathan had taught her to be suspicious of men making promises. Why would you help me? Daniel shrugged. I have been where you are. Different circumstances, but I know what it feels like to be alone and out of options. Besides, I am not helping you. I am bringing Mrs. Parker a potential worker. If she does not want to hire you, that is her decision. But at least you will be warm for tonight, and she will feed you regardless. Mrs. Parker would never turn away someone who needed food and shelter, especially in weather like this. It was not much of a guarantee, but it was more than Catherine had. She nodded. Thank you. I accept your offer to introduce me to Mrs. Parker. The wagon is loaded and ready. Can you ride? Or would you rather sit in the back with the supplies? I can ride, Catherine said. Daniel nodded and disappeared into the stable, returning moments later with a sturdy brown mare already saddled. This is Daisy. She is gentle and sure-footed. I will be driving the supply wagon, so just follow along behind. The ranch road is pretty straightforward, but visibility is getting worse, so stay close. Catherine mounted the horse, grateful for the skills she had learned so long ago. The saddle was a man's saddle, but she managed well enough, arranging her skirts as modestly as possible given the circumstances. Her hands were so cold she could barely feel the reins, but she took them up and settled herself as Daniel watched. You do know your way around a horse, he said, something like approval in his voice. That will serve you well on a ranch. He climbed up onto the wagon seat and clicked to the 2 draft horses hitched to it. They leaned into their harnesses, and the wagon lurched forward. Catherine urged Daisy to follow, and they left Cherry Creek behind, heading north into the storm. The ride took nearly an hour in the heavy snow. Catherine's face went numb, and her hands were beyond feeling. She focused on keeping Daisy moving, following the dark shape of the wagon ahead. Several times she thought she might fall from the saddle from sheer exhaustion and cold, but she gripped tighter and forced herself to stay conscious and alert. Finally, lights appeared through the snow. Daniel guided the wagon toward them, and they emerged into a yard surrounded by several buildings. The main house was larger than Catherine had expected, a solid two-story structure built of logs and milled lumber. Smoke rose from two chimneys, and warm light glowed from multiple windows. A barn stood off to one side, and she could see other outbuildings barely visible through the snow. Daniel pulled the wagon up near the barn and jumped down. He came to Daisy's side and reached up to help Catherine dismount. She half fell into his arms, her legs refusing to hold her properly after the long, cold ride. He steadied her without comment. "Let us get you inside," he said. "I will deal with the horses and wagon after." "I can help," Catherine protested weakly. "You can barely stand. Inside. Now." His tone left no room for argument. He guided her across the yard to the main house and knocked on the door before opening it and ushering her inside. The warmth hit Catherine like a physical thing, and she gasped as feeling started to return to her frozen extremities, bringing with it a painful tingling sensation. "Daniel, is that you?" A woman's voice called from somewhere deeper in the house. "Yes, madam," Daniel called back. "I brought someone who needs help." A moment later, a woman in her mid-40s appeared from what Catherine assumed was the kitchen. She wore a practical wool dress covered with an apron, and her dark hair was streaked with gray and pulled back in a simple bun. Her face was weathered but kind, with laugh lines around her eyes and mouth. "Good heavens, child, you are frozen half to death," the woman said, rushing forward. "Daniel, what were you thinking bringing someone out in this storm?" "The alternative was leaving her in town with nowhere to go," Daniel said. "Mrs. Parker, this is." He paused and looked at Catherine with a slightly sheepish expression. "I apologize. I never asked your name." "Catherine Brennan," Catherine managed through chattering teeth. "Miss Brennan was put out of the boarding house tonight," Daniel explained. "I remembered you saying you needed help around the house, and I thought perhaps you might be willing to give her a chance." Mrs. Parker looked Catherine over with a shrewd but not unkind gaze. "We can discuss that after we make sure she does not lose any fingers or toes to frostbite. Come with me, dear. Daniel, you had better get those horses put away and then come have some supper. It will be stew and biscuits tonight." "Yes, madam," Daniel said, already heading back toward the door. Mrs. Parker led Catherine up a narrow staircase to the second floor and into a small bedroom that held a single bed, a washstand, and a battered wardrobe. "This was my daughter's room until last month. You can stay here for tonight at least. First, we need to get you out of those wet clothes and into something warm." She bustled around, pulling a flannel nightgown from the wardrobe and setting it on the bed, then pouring water from a pitcher into a basin. "This water is not hot, but it is warmer than you are. Wash your face and hands gently. Do not rub too hard or the circulation coming back will be even more painful. Change into this nightgown and I will bring up some warm milk and food." "Mrs. Parker, I do not want to impose," Catherine started, but the older woman cut her off with a wave of her hand. "We will talk about all that tomorrow. Tonight you will warm up, eat, and sleep. Everything else can wait for morning." She left the room, closing the door behind her. Catherine did as she was instructed, peeling off her frozen clothing with clumsy fingers. The water in the basin did feel warm against her icy skin, and she washed carefully, feeling slowly returning to her extremities with uncomfortable prickling sensations. The nightgown was soft and clean, and she pulled it on gratefully, then sat on the bed and waited. Mrs. Parker returned a short time later with a tray holding a large bowl of steaming stew, 2 biscuits, and a cup of warm milk. The smell alone made Catherine's stomach clench with hunger. She realized she had not eaten since breakfast that morning. "Eat slowly," Mrs. Parker advised. I know you are hungry, but if you eat too fast after going without, you will make yourself sick." Catherine nodded and took a spoonful of the stew. It was thick with beef, potatoes, carrots, and onions, seasoned with herbs and salt. It might have been the best thing she had ever tasted. She forced herself to eat slowly, savoring each bite, while Mrs. Parker sat in the room's only chair and watched her. "Daniel tells me you were abandoned in Cherry Creek," Mrs. Parker said after a few minutes of silence. Catherine swallowed a bite of biscuit. "Yes, madam. The man I came west with left 3 days ago and did not return. I believe he does not intend to." "Were you married to him?" "No, madam. We were engaged, or so I believed. He said we would marry once we reached Colorado and got settled. That was 6 months ago." Mrs. Parker's expression tightened slightly, but not with judgment. "Men who lie about their intentions are among the worst sort. I am sorry you experienced that, dear. Now, Daniel mentioned you might be willing to work. What skills do you have?" "I can cook and clean," Catherine said. "I can sew and mend. I know basic gardening, though I have never worked a Western garden. I can ride a horse, and I am not afraid of hard work. I am willing to learn anything you need me to know. Can you read and write?" "Yes, madam. I completed 8 years of formal schooling, and my mother continued teaching me at home after that." Mrs. Parker nodded, looking pleased. "That is more than many folks can claim. Here is the situation. My husband John runs this ranch with the help of Daniel and 4 other men. We run about 300 head of cattle and maintain a small herd of horses. The work is constant, especially during certain seasons. I manage the household, which includes cooking for everyone, cleaning, laundry, mending, maintaining the garden in summer, and preserving food. Since my daughter Emily moved away, I have been handling it all myself, and I am not as young as I used to be. The work is overwhelming me." She paused and looked directly at Catherine. "If I hire you, I will expect you to work hard. The days start early and end late. The pay is $12 a month plus room and board. You will have Sunday afternoons off unless there is an emergency. You will take your meals with the family and the ranch hands. You will have this room as your own. Does that sound acceptable to you?" $12 a month was not much, but with room and board included, it was enough to slowly save something. More importantly, it was security, a place to be, a purpose. Catherine felt tears threaten again, but this time from relief rather than despair. "Yes, madam," she said. "That sounds more than acceptable. I will work as hard as you need me to." "Good. We will start tomorrow morning. For tonight, finish your food and get some sleep. Breakfast is at 5:30, but I will let you sleep until 6 tomorrow since you have had such a difficult day." After Mrs. Parker left, Catherine finished her meal and climbed under the thick quilts on the bed. The mattress was stuffed with straw and not particularly comfortable, but after the prospect of spending the night in the snow, it felt like heaven. She was warm, fed, and safe. For the first time since Jonathan had ridden away, she allowed herself to feel something other than fear and desperation. She woke to pale dawn light filtering through the small window and the smell of coffee and bacon drifting up from downstairs. For a moment, she was disoriented, unsure where she was. Then memory flooded back, along with a bone-deep weariness that made her want to burrow deeper under the quilts. But she had made a commitment, and she would keep it. Her clothes from the previous night were still damp, but someone had left a simple brown dress, a clean shift, and a worn but serviceable apron folded on the chair. Catherine dressed quickly, braided her long brown hair, and made her way downstairs. The kitchen was large and warm, dominated by a massive iron stove and a long wooden table. Mrs. Parker stood at the stove, flipping bacon in a cast iron skillet. She looked up as Catherine entered and smiled. "Good morning, dear. You look better with some color back in your cheeks. There is coffee in the pot on the table. Pour yourself a cup, and then you can start slicing that bread on the counter. We will need at least 20 slices for breakfast." Catherine did as instructed, noting the efficiency of Mrs. Parker's kitchen. Everything had its place, and the older woman moved through the space with practiced ease. Catherine began slicing the large loaf of bread, trying to make each slice uniform. "The men will be in shortly," Mrs. Parker said. "We feed everyone at the same time. My husband John, Daniel, and the 4 other ranch hands, Tom, Miguel, Sam, and young Billy. They are good men, all of them, but they are men, which means they will be curious about you and probably forward with their questions. Do not let them intimidate you." As if on cue, the door opened and men began filing in, stomping snow from their boots and hanging their hats on pegs by the door. They ranged in age from a boy who could not have been more than 16 to a grizzled man who might have been 60. Daniel came in last, and his eyes found Catherine immediately. He nodded to her, a small gesture of acknowledgement and perhaps encouragement. "Everyone, this is Miss Catherine Brennan," Mrs. Parker announced. "She will be helping me with the household work starting today. I expect you all to treat her with respect and courtesy. Miss Brennan, this is my husband John, and the others are Tom, Miguel, Sam, and Billy." John Parker was a solidly built man in his early 50s with sun-weathered skin and sharp gray eyes. He looked Catherine over with the same assessing gaze his wife had used the night before. "Welcome to the Triple Bar, Miss Brennan. I hope you will find the work suits you." "Thank you, sir," Catherine said. The other men offered various greetings, some shy, some friendly, one or two with a speculative look that made Catherine uncomfortable. But Daniel caught those looks and gave the men in question a hard stare that made them immediately find something else to focus on. Breakfast was a boisterous affair, with the men eating enormous quantities of food and talking about the day's work ahead. There were fences to mend, cattle to check on, and preparations to make for the heart of winter that was bearing down on them. Catherine and Mrs. Parker kept the food coming, refilling platters of bacon and eggs, bringing more bread, pouring more coffee. After the men left to begin their work, Catherine helped Mrs. Parker clean up the breakfast dishes. The older woman showed her where everything belonged and how she liked things organized. Then they moved on to the other daily tasks, making beds, sweeping floors, starting laundry, water heating on the stove. The work was indeed hard and constant, but Catherine threw herself into it with determination. She wanted to prove herself worthy of this chance to show Mrs. Parker that bringing her here had not been a mistake. By the time the midday meal needed to be prepared, Catherine's back ached and her hands were red and sore, but she felt a sense of satisfaction she had not experienced in months. Over the following days and weeks, Catherine settled into the rhythm of ranch life. She rose before dawn, helped prepare breakfast for the men, cleaned the house, helped with laundry and mending, assisted with meal preparation, and fell into bed exhausted each night. The work was harder than anything she had done before, but it was honest work, and she found she was good at it. Mrs. Parker proved to be a patient teacher, showing Catherine how to make bread from scratch, how to manage the temperamental stove, how to organize supplies to last through the long winter. Catherine learned that the Triple Bar had been homesteaded by John's father 30 years earlier, that John and Elizabeth Parker had built it into a successful operation through decades of hard work, and that Emily, their only child who had survived infancy, had married a rancher from up north the previous October. "I miss her terribly," Elizabeth confided one afternoon as they worked together on mending. "But I am happy she found a good man who loves her. That is what every mother wants for her daughter." Catherine thought of her own mother back in St. Louis and wondered if she ever thought of the daughter she had cast out. She doubted it. Her father had been very clear when she left. If she went with Jonathan, she was no longer his daughter. Her mother had cried but had not contradicted him. The ranch hands were a varied group, each with his own story of how he had ended up in Colorado territory. Tom was the oldest, a former cavalry soldier who had decided he preferred cattle to military life. Miguel had come up from New Mexico looking for work and had stayed for 5 years now. Sam was quiet and kept to himself, but he was an expert with horses. Billy was a local boy from a poor family, working to help support his widowed mother and younger siblings. And then there was Daniel. Catherine found herself aware of him in a way that both confused and concerned her. She noticed when he came in from working outside, his face reddened from cold, his dark hair curling from beneath his hat. She noticed his hands, strong and capable, as he worked with horses or repaired equipment. She noticed the way he spoke to everyone with courtesy, the way he helped Billy with tasks the younger man had not yet mastered, the way he always thanked Elizabeth for meals even though it was not necessary. He was kind but maintained a certain distance from everyone, as if he had learned not to let people too close. Catherine understood that impulse. She had built her own walls after Jonathan's abandonment. Sometimes she caught Daniel watching her, his expression unreadable. He never approached her inappropriately or made her uncomfortable, but there was something in those moments of eye contact that made her heart beat faster. It was foolish, she told herself. She had just escaped one disastrous relationship. The last thing she needed was to develop feelings for another man, especially one she worked with and depended on for her livelihood. She focused on her work and tried to ignore the flutter in her chest when Daniel smiled at something she said during meals. Winter deepened through December and into January of 1879. The snow piled up in drifts that sometimes reached the windows. The men worked hard to keep paths cleared between the buildings and to ensure the cattle had access to food and water. Several times, storms trapped them all inside for days at a time, and the house felt both crowded and oddly intimate with everyone in close quarters. During one such storm in late January, they all gathered in the main room after supper. Elizabeth was knitting, John was reviewing his account books, and the ranch hands were playing cards at the table. Catherine sat near the fire, working on mending a shirt when Daniel approached and sat in the chair next to hers. "You have been here almost 2 months now," he said quietly. "Are you settling in all right?" "Yes," Catherine said, keeping her eyes on her stitching. "Mrs. Parker has been very kind and the work suits me. Good, I am glad." He was silent for a moment and Catherine felt the weight of his gaze. "I wanted to apologize if I overstepped when I brought you here. I know I did not give you many options that night." Catherine looked up at him then, meeting his eyes directly. "You saved my life, Mr. Connor. I do not think that requires an apology." "Daniel," he said, "if we are going to be sharing meals and working together, you should call me Daniel. And I will call you Catherine, if that is acceptable." "It is," she said, feeling her cheeks warm slightly. "I also wanted to say that I think you have done a remarkable job adjusting to life here. Elizabeth has mentioned several times how much easier things are with you helping her. She is very pleased." That is kind of her to say. She would not say it if it were not true. Elizabeth Parker is many things, but dishonest is not one of them. Daniel leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice even more. "I also wanted you to know that if you ever need anything, or if any of the men make you uncomfortable, you can come to me. I know what it is like to be on your own and vulnerable. I would not want that for anyone." Something in his tone made Catherine curious. "What happened to you, Daniel? You said you had been in a difficult situation once. His expression closed off slightly, and she thought he might not answer. Then he sighed. My parents died of cholera when I was 15. I had a younger sister, Sarah. She was 12. We had no other family, so the state tried to put us in separate orphanages. I ran away with her instead. We made our way west, taking whatever work I could find, moving from town to town. I was trying to keep us together, trying to give her a chance at a decent life. What happened? Catherine asked softly. She died the winter she turned 13, pneumonia. We were in a mining camp in the mountains, and I could not afford a doctor. I held her while she died, and I could not do a damn thing to save her. His voice was rough with old pain. That was 10 years ago, but I remember every moment of it. I remember what it felt like to be helpless and alone. So when I saw you standing in that snow, I could not just walk away. Catherine felt tears prick her eyes. I am so sorry about your sister. Me too. He straightened up, and the vulnerable moment passed, his expression becoming more neutral again. Anyway, I just wanted you to know you have a friend here if you need one. Thank you, Daniel. That means more than you might realize. He nodded and stood, returning to the card game. Catherine watched him go, her heart aching for the boy who had lost everything and the man he had become because of it. February brought a brief thaw that turned the snow to slush before the temperature dropped again and froze everything solid. Catherine celebrated her 21st birthday on the 14th without mentioning it to anyone. It seemed unimportant compared to the daily work of survival. March arrived with howling winds and occasional snowstorms that made everyone irritable and restless. Supplies were running low, and they would need to make a trip to town soon to restock. Catherine found herself dreading the thought of returning to Cherry Creek, even though she knew she would not have to stay there. One afternoon in mid-March, Catherine was in the kitchen preparing vegetables for stew when Elizabeth came in from the cold room looking worried. We are running very low on flour and sugar, she said. Also coffee, which the men will not be happy about. John is planning to take the wagon to town tomorrow if the weather holds. He wants Daniel to go with him in case the roads are bad. I am wondering if you would be willing to go as well. I need quite a few things from the general store, and it would help to have an extra set of hands. Catherine's first instinct was to refuse, but she knew that was cowardice. She had to face the town eventually. Of course, Mrs. Parker, whatever you need. Thank you, dear. I know it might be difficult to go back there, but I promise no one will bother you. John and Daniel will make sure of it. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Catherine dressed in her warmest clothes and climbed up onto the wagon seat next to Daniel while John rode a horse alongside. The trip to town took about an hour and a half in the daylight with good road conditions. Catherine spent most of it watching the landscape, the way the morning sun sparkled on the snow, the dark line of mountains in the distance. First time back since that night? Daniel asked as they got closer to Cherry Creek. Yes, Catherine admitted. It will be different this time. You are not alone. His words settled something anxious in her chest, and she nodded. Cherry Creek looked exactly the same as it had 2 months earlier, except now Catherine was arriving in daylight, warm and well-fed, with employment and security. The difference in her circumstances was striking. They pulled up in front of the general store, and John helped Catherine down from the wagon while Daniel began unloading the supplies they had brought to trade. The general store was warm and smelled of coffee and tobacco. The proprietor, Mr. Hendricks, greeted John warmly and looked at Catherine with surprise. Miss Brennan, is it not? I heard you had left town. I am working at the Triple Bar now, Catherine said, keeping her voice steady and polite. Is that so? Well, good for you. What can I help you folks with today? They spent the better part of an hour selecting and purchasing supplies. Catherine used the list Elizabeth had given her and took her time making sure everything was correct. Other townspeople came and went, and several gave Catherine curious looks. She ignored them, focusing on her task. They were loading the wagon when a familiar voice made Catherine's blood run cold. "Well, if it is not Catherine, I thought you would have frozen to death by now." She turned slowly to find Jonathan standing on the sidewalk, looking much the same as he had 2 months earlier. Perhaps a bit more worn around the edges, his clothes rumpled and his face sporting several days' worth of stubble. "Jonathan." Her voice came out flat and emotionless. "I came back looking for you a few weeks ago, but old Mrs. Henderson said you had disappeared. Where did you go?" "That is none of your concern," Catherine said, turning back to the wagon. Jonathan moved closer. "Now, Catherine, do not be like that. I know I was gone longer than I said, but I had trouble getting the money from my brother. I always intended to come back for you. You are lying." The words came out before Catherine could stop them, and she found she did not care. "You left me here with no money, no shelter in the middle of winter. You knew exactly what you were doing." "That is not fair. I tried. It just took longer than expected." "It has been more than 2 months," Catherine said, her voice rising. "If you intended to come back, you would have been here weeks ago." "I am here now, am I not? Come on, let us get your things and we can head to Denver. I have a place there now, a little room. It is not much, but we can make it work." Catherine stared at him, amazed that he actually seemed to believe she would go with him. "No." "What do you mean, no?" "I mean no. I have employment. I have a place to live. I have no intention of going anywhere with you now or ever." Jonathan's expression darkened. "You are being unreasonable." "We had plans, Catherine. We were going to build a life together." "You abandoned me, Jonathan. Whatever plans we had died the moment you rode out of here and did not come back." He reached for her arm, but before his hand could make contact, Daniel was there, stepping between them. "The lady said no," Daniel said, his voice calm but with an edge of steel underneath. "I suggest you respect that and move along." Jonathan looked Daniel up and down, clearly assessing whether he wanted to start a physical confrontation. Whatever he saw in Daniel's eyes made him step back. "This is none of your business, friend." "I am making it my business. Miss Brennan works for the Triple Bar Ranch. She is under our protection. You will leave her alone." John had also moved closer, and several other townspeople were watching the confrontation with interest. Jonathan must have realized he was outnumbered and outmatched because he held up his hands in a gesture of surrender. "Fine. Catherine, if you change your mind, you know where to find me." "I will not change my mind," Catherine said. Jonathan walked away, and Catherine felt her legs go weak with relief and residual fear. Daniel turned to her, his expression concerned. "Are you all right?" "Yes, thank you for intervening. I do not think he would have hurt me, but he might have made a scene." "Men like that are cowards," Daniel said quietly. "They prey on people they think are vulnerable and alone. He will not bother you again." They finished loading the wagon and began the journey back to the ranch. Catherine was quiet, processing the encounter. Seeing Jonathan again had stirred up all the hurt and anger she had been trying to bury under hard work and routine. But it had also shown her something important. She was stronger now than she had been 2 months ago. She had not needed to be rescued this time. She had stood her ground and told him no. "You did well back there," Daniel said after a while, as if reading her thoughts. "It takes courage to face someone who hurt you." "I was terrified," Catherine admitted. "Courage is not the absence of fear. It is acting despite the fear." "You told him no. You set a boundary. That is strength." Catherine looked at him, this man who had saved her life and asked nothing in return, who had shared his own painful past to help her feel less alone, who noticed when she needed support and offered it without making her feel weak. Thank you, Daniel, for everything. He met her gaze and held it for a long moment. Something passed between them, something warm and significant that Catherine felt all the way to her toes. Then he smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes and transformed his usually serious face. You are welcome, Catherine. The rest of the winter passed without major incident. Spring arrived slowly, with the snow melting in fits and starts, revealing the brown grass and muddy ground beneath. The cattle that had survived the winter were thin but recovering, and the ranch work shifted from maintenance and survival to preparation for calving season and the summer ahead. Catherine had been at the Triple Bar for 4 months now, and she felt as if she had found something she had not even known she was looking for. A purpose, a place where she belonged, people who valued her contributions. Elizabeth had become almost like a mother to her, and John treated her with gruff respect. The ranch hands had accepted her as part of the household, and even young Billy, who had been shy around her at first, now chatted easily during meals. And then there was Daniel. Their friendship had grown slowly through the long winter months. They often found themselves working near each other, Daniel repairing tack in the barn while Catherine hung laundry, or Catherine gathering eggs while Daniel worked with horses in the corral. They talked about small things, the weather, the ranch, books they had read. Daniel had a dry sense of humor that caught Catherine off guard and made her laugh. She found herself seeking out these moments, looking for excuses to be where he was. She knew she was developing feelings for him that went beyond friendship. She tried to be cautious to protect her heart, but Daniel made it difficult. He was kind without being condescending, strong without being domineering, intelligent without being pretentious. He treated her as an equal, someone whose thoughts and opinions mattered. One evening in late April, after a long day of work, Catherine was sitting on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of pink and gold. She heard footsteps and looked up to find Daniel approaching. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. "Not at all." He sat down on the porch steps next to her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him in the cooling evening air. "It is beautiful tonight," he said, looking at the mountains. "It is," Catherine agreed. "I never appreciated scenery like this when I lived in the city. Everything was so crowded and close. Here it feels like you can see forever." "Do you miss St. Louis?" Daniel asked. Catherine considered the question. "I miss some things. I miss my mother, though she made her choice when she let my father disown me. I miss a few friends, but I do not miss the life I had there. I felt trapped, like I was supposed to follow a very specific path and never deviate. Coming west was supposed to be my grand adventure, my chance to live differently. I just did not expect it to be quite so difficult." "Life out here is not easy," Daniel agreed, "but it is honest. You succeed or fail based on your own efforts, not on your family name or social connections. I have always valued that." "You have made a good life here," Catherine observed. "The Parkers clearly trust and respect you. You are more than just a ranch hand. John has been good to me. When I drifted into Cherry Creek 5 years ago, I was pretty lost. I had been moving from place to place, never staying anywhere long because every town reminded me of Sarah and what I had lost. John gave me a job and told me he did not care about my past as long as I worked hard and dealt fairly with him. It was the first time in years anyone had given me a chance like that. Do you think you will stay here? Or do you want something more eventually?" Daniel was quiet for a moment. "I used to think I wanted my own place someday. A small ranch, maybe. Nothing as big as the Triple Bar, but something that was mine. Lately, I have been thinking more about what makes a place feel like home. It is not just the land or the buildings. It is the people." He turned to look at Catherine directly, and the intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. "Catherine, I need to tell you something, and I am not sure how to say it without being too forward." Her heart began to pound. "You can tell me anything. I care about you. More than I should, probably, given our circumstances. I have been trying to ignore it to keep things professional, but I cannot anymore. These past few months, getting to know you, watching you work so hard and build a life here, it has made me realize that I have been only half living for a long time. You make me want more. You make me want a future that is not just about surviving but about actually living." Catherine felt tears prick her eyes, but they were not tears of sadness. "Daniel, I care about you too. I have been trying to convince myself it was too soon, that I should not trust my feelings after what happened with Jonathan. But what I feel for you is completely different from what I felt for him. With Jonathan, I was infatuated with the idea of adventure and romance. With you, I feel safe and valued and seen. I feel like myself." Daniel reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers warm against hers. "I do not want to rush you into anything. I know you have been hurt and I know you need time, but I want you to know that I am not going anywhere. I am here, and I will be here for as long as you want me." "I want you here," Catherine said softly. "I want to see where this leads." He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently, a gesture so tender and old-fashioned that it made Catherine's heart swell. "Then we will take it slow and see where it leads. But Catherine, I promise you this. I will never abandon you. I will never leave you wondering where you stand or whether I am coming back. If I am with you, I am with you completely." "That is all I need," Catherine said. They sat together as the sun finished setting and the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky. Catherine felt a sense of peace she had not experienced since before she left St. Louis. Perhaps even before that. For the first time in a long time, she felt genuinely hopeful about the future. Over the following weeks, Catherine and Daniel's relationship deepened. They were careful to maintain propriety, aware that they were living in a household with others and that Catherine's reputation mattered. But they found time to talk, to walk together in the evenings, to share their thoughts and dreams. John and Elizabeth noticed, of course. They would have been blind not to see the way Daniel and Catherine looked at each other, the way they gravitated toward one another during meals and work. One afternoon in May, Elizabeth brought it up while she and Catherine were working in the garden, planting vegetables for the summer. "Daniel is a good man," Elizabeth said without preamble. "One of the best I have known." Catherine felt her cheeks warm. "Yes, he is. He also had a hard life and it has made him cautious. If he has opened up to you, it means he trusts you deeply. That is not something he does lightly." "I know," Catherine said softly. "He told me about his sister." Elizabeth nodded. "He does not talk about that with most people. John is one of the few who knows the whole story." She paused in her digging and looked at Catherine directly. "I can see that you care for each other. I just want you to know that John and I approve. If things continue to develop between you, you have our blessing." Tears filled Catherine's eyes. "Thank you, Mrs. Parker. That means everything to me. You are a part of this family now, dear. We want you to be happy." Summer arrived with long, hot days and endless work. The cattle were moved to higher pastures, the garden flourished and required constant attention, and there was always something that needed fixing or building or maintaining. Catherine worked alongside Elizabeth, learning to preserve food, to make butter and cheese, to manage all the tasks that kept a ranch household running. Daniel was gone for days at a time with the other men, moving cattle and checking on the herds in distant pastures. Each time he returned, sunburned and exhausted, his eyes would seek out Catherine first thing, and they would share a smile that held all the words they had not been able to say during his absence. In July, Cherry Creek held its annual summer celebration, a day of races, contests, and socializing. The Triple Bar crew made the trip to town, all of them looking forward to a break from routine work. Catherine wore her best dress, a light blue cotton that Elizabeth had helped her make, and Daniel could not take his eyes off her. The town square was crowded with people from all the surrounding ranches and farms. There were horse races, shooting competitions, a pie baking contest, and dancing in the evening. Catherine entered 2 of her pies in the contest and won second place for her apple pie, much to her delight and embarrassment. As evening fell and the dancing began, Daniel approached Catherine and extended his hand. "May I have this dance?" "I would love that," Catherine said, placing her hand in his. He led her to the area that had been cleared for dancing, where a small group of musicians played fiddle and guitar. Daniel was not a particularly skilled dancer, but he was confident enough, and Catherine found she did not care about technique. She cared about the way he held her, respectfully but firmly, and the way he looked at her as if she were the only person in the world. They danced 3 dances before taking a break. As they stood at the edge of the crowd, catching their breath and drinking lemonade, Catherine spotted Jonathan across the square. He was standing with a group of men, and he was staring directly at her. His expression was not friendly. "He is still here," Catherine said quietly, nodding in Jonathan's direction. Daniel followed her gaze and his expression hardened. "I have seen him around town a few times. He works odd jobs, drinks too much, and complains about how unfair life has been to him." "He is exactly the kind of man I thought he was. I just hope he leaves me alone," Catherine said. "If he does not, he will answer to me." They managed to avoid Jonathan for the rest of the evening, and Catherine tried to put him out of her mind. She was happy, happier than she had been in years, and she refused to let Jonathan's presence spoil that. The summer passed in a blur of work and stolen moments with Daniel. By August, Catherine knew she was deeply in love with him. It was different from what she had felt for Jonathan. This love was rooted in friendship and respect, built on shared experiences and genuine understanding. She knew Daniel's flaws and he knew hers, and they chose each other anyway. One evening in late August, as they sat together on the porch after another long day, Daniel took her hand and said, "Catherine, I want to ask you something important, but I need to do it right. Can you be patient with me for a little while longer?" "Of course," Catherine said, though her heart was racing with anticipation. 2 weeks later, Daniel asked John Parker for permission to marry Catherine. John gave his blessing immediately, as did Elizabeth. That evening, Daniel took Catherine for a walk away from the ranch house, to a spot on a small hill that overlooked the valley. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant colors. "Catherine Brennan," Daniel said, taking both of her hands in his, "I love you more than I thought it was possible to love anyone. You have brought light into my life, given me a reason to hope and dream again. I know I do not have much to offer you right now. I do not have land of my own or great wealth, but I have a steady job, money saved, and a heart that is completely yours. Will you marry me?" "Yes," Catherine said, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, Daniel, I will marry you." He pulled her into his arms and kissed her for the first time, a kiss that was tender and passionate and full of promise. When they finally broke apart, both breathless and smiling, Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple gold band. "It was my mother's," he explained. "It is the only thing I have left from her. I know it is not fancy, but it is perfect," Catherine interrupted. "Absolutely perfect." He slipped it onto her finger and it fit as if it had been made for her. They set the wedding date for October, after the cattle drive was finished and before winter set in. Elizabeth threw herself into preparations with an enthusiasm that made Catherine's heart swell with affection. She had never felt more loved or more welcomed than she did in those weeks leading up to the wedding. In late September, a week before the wedding, Catherine went into town with Elizabeth to pick up the fabric for her wedding dress that they had ordered from Denver. They were at the general store when Jonathan appeared again. "Catherine," he said, his voice slightly slurred. It was early afternoon, but he had clearly already been drinking. "I heard you are getting married." "Yes, I am," Catherine said, keeping her voice level and calm. "To that ranch hand." "You could have had me, Catherine. We could have had a good life together." "No, Jonathan, we could not have. You abandoned me and I have moved on. I am happy now and I suggest you do the same." "Happy?" Jonathan laughed bitterly. "You are marrying a man who has nothing. At least I had ambition." "You had lies," Catherine corrected. "Daniel has integrity and loyalty and love. That is worth more than all the ambition in the world." Elizabeth stepped forward, placing herself slightly between Catherine and Jonathan. "I think it is time for you to leave, Mr. Whoever you are. Miss Brennan is not interested in speaking with you." Jonathan looked as if he wanted to argue, but Mr. Hendricks came out from behind the counter, and several other townspeople had stopped to watch the confrontation. "You heard the lady," Mr. Hendricks said. "Move along, Jonathan." Jonathan left, muttering under his breath, and Catherine let out a shaky breath. "Are you all right, dear?" Elizabeth asked. "Yes, I am just tired of him showing up and trying to insert himself into my life. I wish he would leave town." "Men like that rarely have the sense to know when they are not wanted," Elizabeth said. "But do not let him ruin this happy time. Your wedding is in 1 week, and you are marrying a wonderful man who adores you." Catherine smiled. "You are right. Jonathan is not worth another moment of my thoughts." The week passed quickly, filled with final preparations. Catherine and Elizabeth finished the wedding dress, a simple but elegant ivory gown with lace trim. John and the ranch hands scrubbed the house from top to bottom. Billy was sent to pick wildflowers to decorate the main room where the ceremony would take place. The night before the wedding, Catherine could barely sleep from excitement and anticipation. She had come so far from that night in December when she had stood in the snow, abandoned and terrified. Now she was about to marry the man she loved, surrounded by people who had become her family. The wedding took place on a clear October afternoon with the aspen trees blazing gold on the mountainsides. The local preacher came out from town to officiate. Catherine wore her ivory dress and a simple veil, and she carried a bouquet of late-season wildflowers. Daniel wore his best suit, brushed and pressed, his hair neatly combed, his eyes never leaving Catherine as she walked down the makeshift aisle to stand beside him. The ceremony was simple and heartfelt. They exchanged vows, speaking words of love and commitment, promising to stand by each other through whatever trials life might bring. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Daniel kissed Catherine gently, and everyone cheered. The celebration afterward was joyful and boisterous. Elizabeth had prepared a feast, and there was dancing and laughter late into the evening. Catherine felt as if her heart might burst from happiness. She was married to Daniel Connor, and they were going to build a life together. That night, Daniel carried Catherine over the threshold of the small cabin that John had given them as a wedding gift. It was located about a quarter-mile from the main ranch house, a cozy 2-room structure that gave them privacy while keeping them close enough to continue working for the Triple Bar. Daniel had spent weeks fixing it up, repairing the roof, replacing broken windows, building furniture. "Welcome home, Mrs. Connor," Daniel said as he set her down gently. "Mrs. Connor," Catherine repeated, testing the sound of her new name. "I like that." Daniel cupped her face in his hands and kissed her deeply. "I love you, Catherine. I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret choosing me." "I could never regret this," Catherine said. You are the best thing that has ever happened to me." They began their married life with a happiness that felt almost surreal to Catherine. She continued to help Elizabeth with the household work, but now she also had her own home to manage. Daniel continued working for John, but now he came home each evening to a wife who loved him and a cabin that was truly theirs. The first winter of their marriage was cold but bearable because they had each other. They spent long evenings by the fire, talking and planning for the future. Daniel wanted to eventually buy land of their own, to build their own ranch slowly over years of hard work and saving. Catherine wanted children, a family they would create together and protect fiercely. "How many children do you want?" Daniel asked one snowy evening as they lay together in bed, warm under thick quilts. "As many as we are blessed with," Catherine said. "I want our children to grow up knowing they are loved and wanted, that they have a secure home and parents who will never abandon them." Daniel pulled her closer. "They will have all that and more. I promise you, Catherine." Spring came again, and with it, Catherine realized she was pregnant. She told Daniel one evening in March as they sat together after supper, and his reaction was everything she had hoped for. He held her tenderly, tears in his eyes, and whispered, "Thank you. Thank you for giving me a family again." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the spring and summer. Catherine continued working, though Elizabeth insisted she take things easier as she grew larger. Daniel was protective and attentive, always making sure she was not overtaxing herself. In November of 1880, almost exactly 2 years after that terrible night when she had stood abandoned in the snow, Catherine went into labor. Elizabeth and the local midwife attended her, and after many hours of hard work, she delivered a healthy baby boy. Daniel was allowed in immediately after, and he looked at his son with such wonder and love that Catherine cried from sheer happiness. "He is perfect," Daniel said, holding the tiny infant carefully. "What should we name him?" "What about James?" Catherine suggested. "After your father." "James Connor," Daniel said softly. "I like that. James Connor, welcome to the world." Being parents was harder than either of them had expected, but they navigated it together. James was a fussy baby who did not sleep well, and there were nights when both Catherine and Daniel were exhausted beyond measure. But there were also moments of pure joy. James's first smile, his first laugh, the way he reached for them with his tiny hands. Life settled into a new rhythm. Daniel continued working for John while saving every penny he could toward buying their own land. Catherine managed their household and helped Elizabeth when she could, with James strapped to her back in a sling she had sewn. In the summer of 1881, when James was 8 months old, Catherine and Daniel decided to make a trip into Cherry Creek for supplies. It was a rare outing for all three of them, and Catherine was looking forward to showing off her baby and perhaps buying a few small luxuries with the money Daniel had been paid. They arrived in town on a clear, hot day. Cherry Creek had grown slightly in the 3 years since Catherine had first arrived, with several new buildings and a noticeably larger population. They visited the general store, where Mr. Hendricks made a fuss over baby James. They stopped at the feed store, the bank, and the post office. They were loading their supplies into the wagon when Catherine heard a familiar voice behind her. Well, Catherine, and with a baby, how domestic." She turned to find Jonathan standing there. He looked worse than the last time she had seen him. His clothes were dirty and torn, his face unshaven and marked with evidence of frequent drinking. His eyes were bloodshot and angry. "Jonathan," Catherine said coolly, "I have nothing to say to you. That is a shame, because I have something to say to you." He moved closer, and Catherine instinctively backed up, holding James tighter. Daniel was immediately at her side, placing himself between her and Jonathan. Whatever you have to say, you can say to me, Daniel said, his voice hard. This does not concern you, Jonathan said, though his bravado seemed forced in the face of Daniel's solid presence. Anything concerning my wife concerns me. Now say what you came to say or leave. Your wife, Jonathan spat the words. She was supposed to be with me. We had plans. She owes me. I owe you nothing, Catherine said, her voice steady despite the fear creeping up her spine. I do not know why you cannot accept that and move on with your life. Move on. You ruined my life, Catherine. I came out here because you wanted adventure. I invested time and energy into you. And then you threw me over for the first cowboy who showed you attention. You abandoned me in winter with no money and no shelter, Catherine said, her anger rising. I almost died. I do not know what sort of delusion you are living in, but you have no claim on me whatsoever. You are ungrateful, Jonathan said, his voice rising. I am going to make sure everyone in this town knows what kind of woman you really are. That is enough, Daniel said, his tone dangerous now. You will leave my wife alone. You will not speak to her, you will not approach her, you will not say her name. If I hear that you have been spreading lies about her, you will answer to me. Do you understand? Jonathan looked at Daniel, looked at Catherine holding their baby, and something ugly twisted his features. This is not over, he said before turning and stumbling away. Catherine felt her legs go weak, and Daniel immediately supported her. He is just a drunk making empty threats, he said softly. He cannot hurt you. I know, Catherine said. But I am tired of looking over my shoulder, waiting for him to appear. I will talk to the sheriff, Daniel said. Make sure he knows that Jonathan has been harassing you. That way, if he does cause trouble, there is already a record of it. They did visit the sheriff, a gruff older man who listened to their account and promised to keep an eye on Jonathan. He has been nothing but trouble since he arrived in town, the sheriff said. Picking fights, refusing to pay his debts. Nobody will hire him anymore. My guess is he will move on soon enough when he realizes there is nothing left for him here. The ride back to the Triple Bar was tense. Catherine kept thinking about the look in Jonathan's eyes, the rage and resentment. She held James close and tried to tell herself that it would be all right, that Jonathan was just an angry drunk with no real power to harm them. 2 days later, Catherine woke in the middle of the night to the smell of smoke. She sat up in bed, disoriented, and realized she could see firelight through the window. She shook Daniel awake. Daniel, fire. He was up instantly, pulling on his boots and running outside. Catherine wrapped James in a blanket and followed, her heart pounding. The small barn where they kept their 2 horses was engulfed in flames. Daniel was already there with buckets, trying to douse the fire, but it was spreading too quickly. Get the horses out, Catherine screamed. Daniel ran into the burning barn and emerged moments later leading both horses, their eyes white with terror. He slapped their rumps and sent them running toward the main ranch house. By then, John and the other ranch hands had arrived, all of them working frantically to put out the fire and prevent it from spreading to other buildings. They fought the fire for hours. By the time they finally got it under control, the barn was a complete loss, burned to the ground. Everyone was exhausted, covered in soot and ash. Daniel had burns on his hands and arms from going into the barn to save the horses. How did it start? John asked as they all stood looking at the smoldering ruins. I do not think it was an accident, Daniel said grimly. He walked to the side of what had been the barn and pointed at something on the ground. Catherine moved closer and saw it, an empty kerosene can. Someone set this fire deliberately, John said, his face hardening with anger. Who would do such a thing, Jonathan? Catherine said quietly. It has to be Jonathan. He threatened us in town 2 days ago. That son of a... John cut himself off, glancing at Catherine. "We need to tell the sheriff." The sheriff came out that afternoon and examined the evidence. He agreed that the fire had been deliberately set, and he agreed that Jonathan was the most likely suspect. "I will bring him in for questioning," he promised. "If he did this, he will face charges." But when the sheriff went to look for Jonathan, he was nowhere to be found. His room at the boarding house was empty, his few possessions gone. He had left town sometime during the night, presumably after setting the fire. "We will put out a notice," the sheriff said. "If he shows up in any nearby town, we will hear about it. But to be honest, he is probably long gone, and we may never see him again." Catherine felt a mixture of relief and lingering fear. Relief that Jonathan was gone, but fear that he might come back someday, might try to hurt them again. Daniel held her that night as she cried, tears of fear and frustration and exhaustion. "He cannot hurt us anymore," Daniel said. "He is gone and we are safe. But what if he comes back? Then we will deal with it together. Catherine, I will not let him hurt you or James. I promise you that." The weeks passed, then months. There was no word of Jonathan, no sign that he had returned or tried to contact them. Slowly, Catherine began to relax, to believe that perhaps he really was gone for good. They rebuilt the barn with help from John and the ranch hands. Life returned to its normal rhythm. James grew and thrived, learning to crawl and then to walk. Catherine and Daniel talked more seriously about buying their own land, about building their own ranch. In the spring of 1882, an opportunity arose. A small property about 10 miles north of the Triple Bar came up for sale. 80 acres with a creek, good grazing land, and a small cabin. The price was reasonable, and Daniel had almost enough saved. John offered to loan them the difference, to be paid back over time. "We would still work for you," Daniel assured him. "At least for the next few years until we get established." "I know you would," John said, "and I would be glad to have you, but I also want to see you build something of your own. You have earned that, both of you." They bought the property in May, signing the papers in the Cherry Creek land office with shaking hands. Catherine felt overwhelmed with emotion as she watched Daniel sign his name. They owned land. They had a future that was truly theirs. They spent the summer making improvements to the property while still working for the Triple Bar. The cabin was small but solid, and they added a new room for James and any future children. They built a barn, a chicken coop, and fencing for cattle they planned to buy the following spring. It was hard work, exhausting and sometimes frustrating, but they did it together. Catherine had never felt more proud or more satisfied with her life. She was building something real, something that would last. In October, as they celebrated the 3rd anniversary of their wedding, Daniel held Catherine close and said, "Do you remember that first winter when I found you in the snow?" "Of course I remember," Catherine said. "I think about it sometimes and wonder what would have happened if you had not been there that night." "I think about it too," Daniel admitted. "I think about how close I came to not going into town that day, or how I might have taken a different route and never seen you. It makes me grateful for every choice that led me to that moment because it brought you into my life." "It brought us to each other," Catherine corrected. "You saved me, but I think I saved you too in a way." "You did," Daniel agreed. "You gave me a reason to live instead of just survive. You gave me a family and a future. I love you more than I can ever express, Catherine Connor." "I love you too, Daniel. Always." They kissed as the sun set over their land, their son playing at their feet, their future bright with possibility. The years that followed were not without challenges. There were droughts and harsh winters, cattle that died, crops that failed. Catherine had 2 miscarriages that left her heartbroken before successfully giving birth to a daughter they named Sarah, after Daniel's lost sister. Sarah was born in 1884, a healthy, strong-willed baby who looked like her father. 2 years later, they had another son they named Robert. By then, their ranch was starting to thrive. They had built their herd to 50 head of cattle, added more horses, and expanded their cabin into a proper house. They still maintained close ties with the Triple Bar and with John and Elizabeth, who had become like parents to them both. In the fall of 1886, 6 years after Catherine and Daniel had married, they were in town for the annual harvest celebration when Catherine saw a familiar figure. For a moment, she thought it was Jonathan, and her heart clenched with fear. But as the man turned, she realized it was not him. The resemblance was superficial. She was about to turn away when she heard someone mention Jonathan's name. She moved closer to the group of men talking and listened. "Yeah, I heard he died up in Montana somewhere," one man was saying. "Got into a fight over cards and the other fellow shot him." "Can't say I'm surprised," another man replied. "Jonathan was always looking for trouble." Catherine felt a strange mixture of emotions: relief, sadness, and something like closure. Jonathan was gone, truly gone, and he would never threaten her or her family again. She found Daniel and told him what she had heard. He listened quietly, then pulled her into a hug. "I am sorry he died that way," he said, "but I am glad you can finally stop looking over your shoulder." "Me too," Catherine said. "It feels like the last shadow has lifted." They danced that evening under the stars, surrounded by their children and friends. Catherine looked around at the life they had built, at the community they were part of, at the family they had created. She thought about that terrible winter night 8 years ago when she had stood in the snow, abandoned and terrified, with no idea how she would survive. She thought about Daniel finding her, about the promise he had made to himself to help someone who needed it. She thought about all the choices and coincidences that had led them to this moment. "What are you thinking about?" Daniel asked as they swayed to the music. "Just about how far we have come," Catherine said. "About how different my life is now from what I imagined it would be." "Better or worse?" Daniel asked with a slight smile because he already knew the answer. "So much better," Catherine said. "Better than I ever dreamed possible." The years continued to pass, each one bringing its own joys and sorrows. They had 2 more children, another daughter named Elizabeth after Mrs. Parker, and a son they named John. Their ranch grew and prospered. James, their eldest, showed a natural talent for working with horses and took over much of that aspect of the operation. Sarah was brilliant and determined, insisting on learning to read and write beyond the basic education most ranch children received. Daniel and Catherine grew older together, their love deepening with each passing year. They had built something real and lasting, not just a ranch but a family and a legacy. They had taken pain and loss and transformed it into purpose and joy. On their 20th wedding anniversary, they stood together on the porch of their house, watching the sun set over the mountains. Their 5 children were inside, laughing and arguing and being exactly themselves. Cattle grazed in the distance. Horses moved in the corral. Everything was peaceful and good. "You remember what I said to you that first night?" Daniel asked. "That I promised never to abandon you." "I remember," Catherine said. "I have kept that promise." "You have," Catherine agreed. "Every single day for 20 years. "I was abandoned in winter twice before I met you," Catherine said softly, thinking of her parents' disownment and Jonathan's betrayal. "You promised me forever and said the 3rd time would be the charm. You were right." Daniel pulled her close and kissed her forehead. "The 3rd time was the charm, because the 3rd time was with the right person. You are my home, Catherine. You always have been and you always will be." As the last rays of sunlight faded from the sky and the first stars began to appear, Catherine and Daniel stood together, surrounded by the life they had built and the love they had nurtured. The Wild West had tested them with its harsh winters and unforgiving landscape, but they had survived and thrived. Their children would grow up and have families of their own. The ranch would be passed down through generations. The story of how Catherine and Daniel found each other would be told and retold until it became family legend. But at this moment, on this evening, it was simply their life. Hard-won, deeply cherished, and absolutely real. The third time had indeed been the charm, and the promise of forever was one that Daniel Connor kept every single day for the rest of his life. Years later, when they were old and gray, sitting together on that same porch while grandchildren played in the yard, Catherine would sometimes think back to that terrified young woman standing in the snow with nowhere to go and no one to help her. She would remember the cowboy who appeared out of the storm and offered her not just survival but a future. And she would smile, take Daniel's weathered hand in hers and whisper, "Thank you for finding me." And Daniel would squeeze her hand and whisper back, "Thank you for staying." Because that was the real story, the one worth telling. Not just that he found her, or that he saved her, but that they chose each other every single day afterward. Through hard times and good times, through winters that threatened to break them and summers that promised renewal, they chose each other. That was what forever meant. Not a single promise made in a moment of passion, but 1,000 small choices made day after day, year after year. It meant showing up, doing the work, keeping faith even when things were difficult. It meant building a life together, one day at a time, until those days became years, and those years became a lifetime. And in the end, sitting on their porch watching the sun set over land they owned and worked together, surrounded by children and grandchildren whose existence proved that love could triumph over abandonment and fear, Catherine and Daniel knew they had succeeded. The third time had been the charm. The cowboy had promised forever, and forever was exactly what they got.